Okay. Okay, go ahead. So really, as you look, there will be many camellias in the photos that were taken around Gainesville, many even in my mother's backyard, because she has 50-year-old beautiful camellia bushes. And the timeline that we're going to be going through is starting about 1883 up until about 2020. And it will be a series of events that I'm going to try to connect together in a way that will make sense for you. That's sort of a fun journey of discovery. Next slide. And so the talk is dedicated really to several people. One is my father, who studied the brain and considered that a work of art. I consider camellias a work of art. My mother, who loved camellias and has 50-year-old bushes and was in a garden club with Mrs. Wilmont, who I will mention, Royal Wilmont of Wilmont Gardens. Dean Tisher, who had the courage and foresight to rediscover Wilmont Gardens. Harold Hume, and then Royal Wilmont. Next slide. And so this is really a story to me of life's beautiful interconnections. And I love to think about how I'm connected and how we're all connected, and even connected to plants and the earth. And this really starts with me in the middle, being interested in views. Then, we have Dr. Sarah Lucretia Robb, Harold Hume, Royal Wilmont, Dr. Dean Tisher, and Dr. George Harrell, who founded the medical school. Next slide. And so if you don't learn anything else, just remember that spare time in the garden, either digging, setting out, or weeding, there's no better way to preserve your health. And so I think part of this talk is that if you're out in nature, gardening, appreciating, tending, you're actually also improving your own health and well-being. Next slide. And so since I practice medicine, my job is to tend people, their wellness, their health every day. And so this is a young family medicine doctor who started gardening when he first went out and practiced. And what he realized is what he learned tending his plants and changing little things and adding nutrients and things of that nature taught him to be a better physician, because you also have to tend to your patients and care for them and observe them and grow with them. Next slide. And so some of these are just fun pictures of camellias. So all those camellias arranged in the heart are ones that I found on the ground. They fall off the trees because they're heavy. And so the Japanese don't like them in arrangements because they think when the bloom falls, it looks like somebody's head got chopped off. And they don't like that. When you arrange them on the ground or see them in the air, they're beautiful. Next slide. And so, there are really proven health benefits that nature can offer. It's a great distraction. It reduces stress and anxiety, and it can offer psychological comfort. And if you look at those pictures, the bottom picture is 2006, before Dr. Tisher committed his life to rejuvenating Wilmont Gardens. And above is what it looks like now if you walk across the bridge in the middle of the garden. It's beautiful. Next slide. And so I'm going to start this by just telling you a little bit about camellias. You may know more about them than I do, but I found this pretty fascinating, that basically they originated from the Orient, from China and Japan, and there's more than 20,000 named varieties. The camellia was named by Linnaeus after a priest by the name of Camel, Joseph Camel. And the most popular camellia is Camellia Sinensis, which is also, I didn't know this, maybe everyone here knew it, it's also the tea plant. So when you drink tea, you're drinking really camellia leaves that are prepared in many different ways, traditional teas. And in 1650, the East India Company brought this to Europe, and it became such a popular beverage that it spread all over the world. And eventually you could say that the camellia was the origin of the revolution that caused the United States to separate from Britain when the Boston Tea Party occurred.
Make sure we're.
Oh, okay. Okay. Next slide. And there's many beautiful shapes, many beautiful colors and varieties that have been described. Next slide. And so it turns out that a medical person was the first person that brought camellia specimens out of China from the island of Shushan on a ship to Europe. He did not make it. But then the samples that he had collected were given to James Petiver, who then described the camellia. That was the original European description. And eventually his drawings and specimens were put in the British Royal Museum. Next slide. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is that camellias have multiple other functions. So we do get tea from camellia leaves, that particular variety. There's a camellia seed that's used as an oil and an extract that may have many health benefits. There's more and more medical articles appearing about the properties of camellia seed oil. And then, of course, there's many beautiful varieties that are, decorative plants in gardens all over. And if you look on the back table, the earliest camellias, the sasanquas, are now just starting to bloom in Gainesville. And that's a little bit early, it seems to me, but I brought some beautiful flowers from my plants. Next slide. And so, what does local medicine have to do with this story that I'm telling you? And so basically, the story is really starting with Sarah Lucretia Robb. Who's heard of the Robb House? Raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of people have. So the Robbs were an original medical couple in the Gainesville community. Sarah Robb was the first female physician in Alachua County. Next slide. And she tried to go to medical school in the United States, was not accepted. She had been a busy mother-baby nurse at Hahnemann in Philadelphia, but was never accepted to a U.S. medical school, but she was determined. So she went to Germany, got trained there, and then came back and established her practice in Alachua County with her husband. And she primarily treated diseases of women and children. So I feel connected to her through that experience. She rode around in a horse and buggy, seeing patients in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And she died when she was 87 in 1937. Next slide. And so, not only was she a dedicated physician, but she also was an author, and they wrote a very thick medical book, the Robb's Family Medicine book. It's about this thick. It's about the size of Sir William Osler's Principles and Practices of Medicine. It came out about the same time. And it was a mixture of allopathic and homeopathic because her husband was a homeopathic physician. She was a traditional medical physician. So it's a cool collection of both types of medicine. They were entrepreneurs, and they also started a local school. Okay. Oh, nice. Thank you. That's perfect. Yeah, it's a good thick book. It's sort of fun to read and see what's in there. Next one. And the other thing about her was that she already a long time ago, before most people thought exercise was safe, they used to say, like, if you're pregnant, don't move, you have to lay in bed, don't exercise. She always promoted physical fitness and exercise and getting outdoors and enjoying nature. So she was ahead of her times in that regard. And the other thing that she did that I think connects her to this story with camellias is she was one of 8 founding members of the Gainesville Garden Club. That club was founded in 1924 and originally had about 100 members. It's grown into a huge garden club that does many philanthropic, educational, and local gardening projects. And so and eventually there was a Camellia Circle. My mother was in the garden club for many, many years and loved it. And so she has a legacy as a medical practitioner and someone who appreciated the importance of gardens and flowers and nature. Next slide. And so, I always wonder, did these people know each other? I'm not really sure, but I want to think they might have because it wasn't that big of a town back then. But around the same time in Gainesville, 1907, Gainesville was chartered as a city. There were other things happening. So next slide. And so if you look at the history of the University of Florida paralleling Sarah Robb coming here and practicing medicine, she was around at the time when the University of Florida was finally named. Then in 1924, it became coeducational. In the 1940s, we're going to talk a lot more about Hume and Howard Hume and Royal Wilmont. They were studying camellias and founded the American Camellia Society in Gainesville. In the 1950s, a person with great foresight established the medical school, and then eventually the teaching hospital and other schools of medicine that we have now in our city. Next slide. And so Dr. Harold Hume was an amazing person, I believe, who worked at the University of Florida for some years. Then he left and went to Glen St. Mary's Nursery. Have any of you been there? It's a beautiful historic nursery just outside of Stark. And back in the late 1800s, they had the largest citrus grove in the state of Florida. And the Tabor azalea was developed there, and it's now a 5th generation Tabor family member who runs that nursery. But Hume went there and worked on camellias and citrus and pecans or pecans, whatever you call them, and developed a big reputation in the citrus world, and eventually became the grand old man of agriculture, and he was inducted into the Citrus Hall of Fame. So he was an interim president at UF and a provost. So he had I always wondered, my son lived in Hume dorm, who was Hume? But then when I was reading my Camellia journal, I read a letter that Hume had written when he established the American Camellia Society. So that's who he is. Now I know who that dorm was named after. Next slide. And he did a lot of work on the color and classification of camellias. He wrote some of the very early descriptive books. Next slide. And he made this very profound quote that I agree with. Not only does man cultivate his fruit trees, but if he approaches his work in the right spirit, his fruit trees cultivate him. So he was believing in the connection between health and nature and enjoying life and tending your plants. And this is some of the descriptions just to give you an idea of his historical works. I went and took a tour of that nursery and their archives, and it was actually really fascinating. Next slide. And then it turns out his very good friend, and I would say his mentee, was Royal Wilmont, who is another horticulturalist at the University of Florida. Royal was one of the founding members, along with Dr. Hume, of the American Camellia Society, which was founded on the UF campus September 29th, 1945. And they worked on the Camellia Yearbook that comes out once a year. It still does. If you're a member, you get it every year. And Hume was heartbroken when, at age 52, Wilmont died suddenly. He was a young man, and Hume was really devastated because they worked so closely together. And then in his memory, friends and colleagues from around the United States sent 300 rare camellias to the University of Florida, and it was in his honor that they started Wilmont Gardens in its present location. Next slide. And this is, again, just showing you some of the work that they did together, describing, I guess, Royal Wilmont at the time was one of the most highly regarded specialists in describing camellias and sorting out what had been called two names and clarifying what was what. And so he spent, most of his career just classifying and reclassifying camellias. Next slide. And these are some examples of, there's the original American Camellia Society yearbook up till a more recent, a more recent version. And the top right is a sketch of the earliest sketch of camellias that's on file in the, Eastern or Western history of camellias. Next. So at the same time, in the same area, the medical community was growing and the hospital was starting. Next slide. And it was due to Dr. George Harrell that eventually in 1956, just after, Wilmont Gardens was established, just down the road from the medical school, he became the dean and established UF as a medical school in Gainesville, Florida. And he emphasized teaching in small groups and focusing on the patient. And he obviously, led the way for what's become a leading school in Florida. And he's the only dean in the United States that went on and established a second school at the University of Pennsylvania in Hershey. He's the only person that's done that. Next slide. And it's interesting to me, if you look up in the middle top of this picture, that was the original faculty. It's about 20 males. There were a total of 4 females in the beginning, and now there's 1,500 people, or 1,300 approximately, on the faculty in the College of Medicine. Next slide. And so just after the medical school had been established, we moved to Gainesville so that my father could start working in the Department of Neurosurgery. And I wouldn't be here now if it weren't for that move. So I'm grateful that I ended up in Gainesville. I actually love living here. Next slide. And he believed that, this up on the left is a picture of the brain. And he believed that every piece of tissue they dissected and studied in his neuroanatomy lab would be a work of art. He believed there could be a creative connection between art and medicine. And I hope that this talk will show you that that is the case. Next slide. And this is a beautiful camellia from my mother's yard last year. Next slide. And so, of course, everyone's heard of Gatorade, right? So, that's another thing that in the 60s, Gatorade was invented. And then eventually we went on to have a college of veterinary medicine, a college of dentistry, and really have covered all the health related fields in our university. Next slide. And these are some more camellias that have been planted around campus related to the rejuvenation of Wilmont Gardens. They actually got more camellias from donations from Ocala than they could fit in the spaces. So they put them all over campus, not just in Wilmont Gardens. Next slide. And finally, this brings us back to another project that started, which is a connection between the local medical community and Camellias, which is that Wilmont Gardens is very close to a huge health center. And so even back in the 1970s, there were people that thought that Wilmont would be a great place for the ornamental horticulture department to develop an area of excellence in therapeutic horticulture. And so it didn't happen at that time, but that thought was out there. And I don't know if you've never walked through there, it's worth just parking somewhere near the dentistry building or the medical plaza and just taking a walk, especially in the winter when the camellias are blooming, because right when you enter that little tiny forest, the air gets cooler, it's shady, there's a breeze. It's like you've entered an oasis. Next slide. And there's beautiful camellias like that you can't believe they're even real. And so many, they're even sometimes covering the ground. Next slide. And so this is Lee Dial, who's the therapeutic horticulture teacher. She started a program in 2012. They now run classes in the greenhouse from about September through April. Then the greenhouse gets too hot. And she does an amazing job, you know, helping people feel better, reduce stress, relieve anxiety, you know, stop having PTSD, trying to live with cancer. All those have been programs that she's done in that greenhouse. Next slide. And so, I mean, basically what this says is that there is good evidence now from multiple studies that using plants as therapy can be beneficial for health and recovery programs. So this is what we've learned. And so this really ties, you know, the medical community back to the garden, where there now is American Camellia Trail designation. Next slide. And I think, you know, Rachel Carson wrote a lot of beautiful books about nature and was a huge advocate. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. And I think that is true. Next slide. Okay. Okay, next. And these are just some more beautiful, these are, you know, triplets from one tree, but they don't all look the same. Okay, next. And just another beauty. And so in conclusion, basically, you know, I would say that through the forces of, you know, Sarah Robb and Hume and the fortunate location of the medical community at UF to Wilmont Gardens, we did have the foundation of the American Camellia Society in Gainesville. It was founded in 1945. And Hume, you know, wrote a letter to Wilmont to support the formation of this group. Howard Hume was the first president. And at that first meeting, there were 100 participants. Now it's grown into a society that has about 8,000 members. So it's a huge group. And the Camellia Trail location in Wilmont Gardens was generously donated by the Mendenhall family. And so that's a beautiful trail where you can walk down, and it's been recognized by the American Camellia Society. Next slide. And I think we also owe a thanks to Sarah Robb and her local friends who had the foresight to establish the Gainesville Garden Club that is committed to, promoting the benefits of nature, teaching nature-related subjects, doing community outreach events. And without, that thought at the time, that may never have occurred. And now that's an active local group. Next slide. I wonder where their pictures went. So anyway, this was a family picture of the Robs at their family reunion in 1926. And there's about, somehow they're not there, but it's like, I don't know what happened. There's about 30 of them meeting in Gainesville. So her legacy was a multifold legacy. It was a legacy for the gardens. She left a legacy and a large family. She made a legacy on the local medical community. And to me, that's how the history of camellias in our community leads back to local medical history. Thank you. Any questions or yeah? Sure.
Thank you for doing the presentation. That piece of property, which was the Camellia Garden for Wilmont, built in his honor after his death. Right after the run, this is the picture. And that is a terrible problem.
Yeah.
And it was going to be and Dr. Tischer and his executive assistant Linda fought very hard for the cleaning off the property. Actually, part of them did some of the pulling the vines.
Nice.
And it was very interesting. Pull vines, if you find fire.
Oh, you're kidding. Huh. Oh, you're kidding. How?
So soon, and it's sometimes grows, and it's very beautiful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Soothing. I mean, it's a wonderful winter plant. The gardens.
Yeah.
Yellow cane. They help.
Yeah, Dr. Tischer always says he retired and then he was starting to get slightly bored or something after a minute. And it caught him because he always loved azaleas and camellias, even in his own yard. I've seen it. And so this was a great project, and he's turned it into a most amazing, beautiful place. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you contact Glen St. Mary's Nursery, look it up on the internet, Glen St. Mary's, they will, if you arrange it, they'll let you come and have a tour. They do weddings there. They have some of that, like the house where Hume lived, and some of the other original houses are still there. And so it's now also a wedding venue. And then some of the family also still lives on the property, a large amount of the family. And now they don't grow. It's interesting. I asked all these questions. They don't grow almost any citrus. They were all destroyed in that one freeze we had back like in the early 90s or something. But they mostly now are growing yews, ornamental yew trees, yew bushes, Y-E-W. And that's a huge market for them. They also do a lot of azaleas. And obviously the Tabor azalea was developed there. And the 5th generation of Tab Tabor, now runs the place. Yeah, I think it's next week, maybe. Yeah, it's a nice sale. They sell all kinds of like camellias, azaleas, other things. It's real well done. Yeah.
I remember reading in the Gainesville Sun back when it had local articles about the rediscovery of Vermont gardens in the woods. What was the reason that you had those little what?
It's hard to say. Maybe it was unburied in 2006. So it started in 1950. Did I say 50? So I said, what did I say? Yeah, so around 45. So somewhere between when Wilmont died and, things growing up, someone just stopped paying attention to it. And I think the biggest amazing thing is just what you said, Pat, that someone knew it was even there. I ran by it for years and didn't know it was anything. I just thought it was like an abandoned woods. And then, it turns out it was something. Just amazing that the chance, that the interconnection that occurred to make that happen.
First time I did this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes, sir.
I think part of the impetus for the rediscovery of when Noel Lake, the head rep, was passed away. I think that's when the Fisher got involved. League,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, great. They talked about gardens and having a big emphasis on that.
Wow. Uh-huh.
So
Mm-hmm.
it just is what was seen on highly recommended. And there are 3 gardens.
Nice. Yeah. Yes.
That was cool. She's honest. I think the garden picture. But the picture on because when you look at the window of the and and well, still, but the window did a lot more tissue was, I guess, because he was a priest who was administrator, he became aware create the
Maybe create the infrastructure for that to happen. Wow. Mm-hmm.
students involved for programs, did a lot of reading and done so without the volunteers. With all the hours.
Yeah. Well, I think, well, and I don't know them per se, but I think that's right. When you read, I think they were heavily, involved right there with him from the very beginning, or maybe even before. I just don't know them as well. They deserve probably a thank you note at this point for what they've done and the legacy that will leave behind, yeah.
The name of the community was in that area. What's the origin? Where is
I don't know if I know, but that's where this place is. It's right off I-10. Well, if you're coming down I-10 to go to the exit on 301 where you go towards Stark, it's just off I-10, like more by Rayford, maybe. It is, which isn't much of a, there's not a lot there. There's very little there. But that's where it's in Glen St. Mary's, Florida. And that's the name of the nursery, Glen St. Mary's Nursery. Mm-hmm.
Did you say that you, man, you're you?
Well, he worked there for about 10 years. And so when he was working there, he lived on the property. And they had maybe like when it was at its peak, I mean, there were hundreds of people that lived there for the citrus, crop. They had a huge company and they were, they have all their labels and they had a packing house. And I mean, it was a major operation back in the early 1900s. One of the biggest packing houses in Florida, actually. And it's sort of cool when you go there to visit, they can show you all their citrus catalogs. They also grew thousands of roses there. That was one of their other major commercial crops. And so at one time they were one of the major like rose providers, for people around the country, shipping everywhere. Yeah. Oh, that's nice. Okay. Uh-huh.
And they're all huge.
I've been to that show and it is incredible. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen the show. I've never seen so many different beautiful camellias in my life. It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Well, let's see. We got one more question. Yeah. Yeah.
He was just like incredibly dedicated to it. And I would take my breaks like almost, if not every day, like every other day, watching that garden. Speaking to like health, mental health, and like nature and the flowers and stuff. I didn't know anything about flowers. I kind of still don't, but like it still had an effect on me.
But you still feel something different when you're there, even if you don't know. Yeah, and you can't know every plant, but the plants give you a feeling.
For sure.
Yeah, well, that's a nice story.
It's not a comment, so fortunate. Straight. Maybe. Say from and more recently there's on campus was blooming us trees that
Yeah, I remember that by the baseball field. Yeah.
with different native plant varieties that you stay working and seeds we let us spend time and that was sure was part of the development. So I think for those of us it's really important what you best and especially when it's woodland or bars and trying.
Yeah, by the back house, there's another little plot by the Bauman Center. So hopefully yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, of course the back. Donor at this time.
Oh, nice. Very nice. Yeah.
Farmers, fields, and garden boxes.
Yep. We've kept a couple, so that's good. So listen, thank you.